Steve Harvey had navigated countless challenging moments during his 15 years hosting Family Feud, managing difficult personalities, diffusing tensions, and maintaining professional composure even when contestants tested his patience through provocative behavior or inappropriate comments. His ability to separate personal feelings from professional responsibilities had allowed him to remain effective as a host regardless of what contestants said or did, understanding that their behavior typically reflected nervousness, competitive intensity, or simply poor social judgment rather than genuine malice. However, on a Wednesday afternoon in November 2024, Steve would encounter a situation that violated one of the few absolute boundaries he maintained in his professional life, forcing him to respond to behavior that transcended the usual category of difficult contestant management and entered territory where his personal values and his family loyalties demanded a response that went beyond his typical hosting protocols. The incident would reveal aspects of Steve Harvey's character that audiences rarely witnessed, demonstrating that beneath his professional persona existed a man with deep family commitments and protective instincts that would override his usual tolerance for inappropriate behavior when those he loved were subjected to attack. What transpired during this taping would become one of the most discussed moments in Family Feud history, not because of the insult itself, but because of the controlled intensity of Steve's response, which communicated unmistakable boundaries while maintaining the dignity and professionalism that had characterized his entire career. Before we explore this remarkable confrontation and its broader implications, if you appreciate content about family loyalty, appropriate protective responses, and the demonstration of boundaries enforced with controlled intensity rather than reactive aggression, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories about the moments that reveal our deepest values and our willingness to defend those we love against unjustified attack. The Morrison family from Detroit, Michigan had traveled to Los Angeles for their Family Feud appearance with enthusiasm that production staff recognized as typical of families who had watched the show extensively and who felt thoroughly prepared to compete effectively. The family was led by 42-year-old Daniel Morrison, a corporate attorney whose professional success had apparently created communication patterns that worked effectively in adversarial legal contexts, but that proved problematic in the collaborative entertainment environment that Family Feud required. His wife Amanda, their adult son, Daniel's sister, and his mother comprised the rest of the team, and they had clearly invested considerable time in preparing for their appearance through study of common survey responses and practice sessions that had familiarized them with the show's format and timing requirements. The taping progressed normally through the initial rounds, with both families demonstrating solid game show knowledge and with Daniel Morrison providing responses that were strategically sound, even if his delivery style was somewhat more aggressive than typical contestants employed. Steve Harvey had established adequate rapport with the Morrison family during the opening introductions, engaging in standard banter about Detroit, legal careers, and family dynamics that created serviceable entertainment without generating the exceptional warmth that characterized his interactions with some contestants. The atmosphere was professional and functional rather than genuinely warm, but nothing in the early portions of the taping suggested that serious conflict would emerge. The situation that would trigger Steve's protective response occurred during a commercial break in the third round, when contestants typically relaxed and engaged in informal conversation while preparing for the continuation of gameplay once cameras resumed recording. Daniel Morrison approached Steve during this break period, apparently emboldened by competitive energy and perhaps by a legal professional's comfort with aggressive argumentation, and made comments that began as critique of Steve's hosting style but quickly escalated into territory that crossed boundaries Steve had maintained inviolable throughout his career. Daniel suggested that Steve's success as a host owed more to fortunate timing and network support than to genuine talent, a comment that was inappropriate, but that fell within the range of provocations Steve had learned to manage through his years in entertainment. However, Daniel then made the catastrophic decision to extend his critique beyond Steve's professional work into commentary about Steve's family, specifically making disparaging remarks about Steve's wife Marjorie, and suggesting that Steve's third marriage represented a pattern of relationship dysfunction that undermined his credibility as someone who offered relationship advice through his various books and media appearances. The reaction in the studio was immediate and unmistakable. The casual conversations that had been occurring during the commercial break ceased entirely as people recognized that Daniel Morrison had ventured into territory that was fundamentally different from typical contestant provocations. Production staff members who overheard the comment exchanged alarmed glances, uncertain whether the situation required immediate intervention or whether Steve would manage it himself. The other members of the Morrison family appeared shocked and embarrassed, clearly recognizing that Daniel had crossed a line that should have been obvious to anyone with basic social awareness. The competing families stood in uncomfortable silence, processing what they had just witnessed and uncertain about their appropriate response. Steve Harvey's physical reaction to Daniel's insult of his wife was controlled but unmistakable to those observing closely. His posture straightened, his expression shifted from the relaxed demeanor that had characterized the commercial break to something harder and more focused, and his eyes fixed on Daniel Morrison with an intensity that communicated that what happened next would be fundamentally different from his usual contestant interactions. The brief silence that followed Daniel's comment felt charged with potential energy, as though everyone present recognized that they were witnessing a critical moment that would require careful navigation to avoid escalating into genuine conflict. What Steve Harvey said during the next several minutes would demonstrate his ability to defend his family with absolute clarity and controlled intensity while maintaining sufficient professional composure to avoid creating a situation that would damage his reputation or undermine his effectiveness as a host. Steve began by addressing Daniel directly in a tone that was quiet but unmistakably serious, making clear that a boundary had been crossed that would require immediate acknowledgement and correction before any further interaction could occur. Steve explained to Daniel that he had tolerated various provocations during their interactions because he understood that competitive energy and nervous tension sometimes manifested in ways that were not ideal but that could be managed through professional hosting techniques. He acknowledged that his career, his personal life, and his relationship history were matters of public record that people were entitled to discuss and critique. However, Steve made absolutely clear that making disparaging comments about his wife crossed a boundary that was non-negotiable and that would provoke a response regardless of the professional context in which such comments occurred. Steve then provided context about his marriage to Marjorie that was more personal and detailed than he typically shared in professional settings, explaining that he wanted Daniel and everyone else present to understand why the insult had been particularly offensive and why it demanded a response that went beyond his usual tolerance for inappropriate contestant behavior. Steve described how Marjorie had been a stabilizing presence in his life during a period when he was achieving professional success but struggling with personal relationships and family dynamics that had suffered from years of prioritizing career over genuine connection. He spoke about the ways that Marjorie had helped him become a better man, a more present father, and a more balanced person who understood that success meant nothing if it was not built on foundation of genuine relationships and family commitment. Steve explained that his willingness to write and speak about relationships, despite his own history of failed marriages, reflected not hypocrisy, but rather hard-won wisdom that came from making mistakes, experiencing their consequences, and developing through painful self-examination into someone who understood what healthy relationships required. He noted that his credibility on relationship topics came not from having always succeeded, but from having failed, learned, and ultimately found in his marriage to Marjorie the kind of partnership that his earlier relationships had lacked. He made clear that disparaging his wife was not merely an insult to her, but represented an attack on the relationship that had enabled him to become the person he was, and that had given him the stability and happiness necessary to maintain the demanding career that allowed him to host Family Feud and to interact with contestants like Daniel Morrison. The intensity and personal nature of Steve's response created an atmosphere in the studio that was unprecedented in the show's history. This was not the usual deflection of contestant provocations through humor or the enforcement of behavioral boundaries through professional hosting authority. This was a man defending his wife and his marriage with controlled but unmistakable passion, communicating that regardless of professional protocols or entertainment considerations, certain boundaries existed that would provoke genuine protective responses when violated. Steve then addressed the broader issue of why Daniel's comment had been particularly inappropriate given the context of their interaction. He explained that appearing on Family Feud created a relationship between host and contestant that carried implicit expectations of mutual respect, that contestants who chose to participate in the show accepted an obligation to treat the host with basic courtesy even if they disagreed with his opinions or disapproved of aspects of his personal life. He noted that Daniel's decision to use access gained through participating in the show to insult Steve's wife represented a fundamental violation of the trust that made collaborative entertainment production possible. Steve provided Daniel with a clear choice that was framed as a genuine decision rather than as a veiled threat. Daniel could immediately and sincerely apologize for his insulting comment about Marjorie, acknowledge that he had crossed a boundary that should have been obvious, and commit to conducting himself with appropriate respect for the remainder of the taping. Alternatively, if Daniel felt unable or unwilling to offer that apology, the production would immediately replace him with an alternate family member, and Daniel would leave the studio without participating further in the game. Steve made explicitly clear that this was not negotiable, that no amount of competitive energy or nervous tension justified insulting someone's spouse, and that he would accept nothing less than genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing and commitment to different behavior going forward. The directness and intensity of Steve's ultimatum left Daniel Morrison with limited options. He could either acknowledge that he had behaved inexcusably and offer sincere apology, or he could maintain his position and face the immediate consequence of removal from the taping. The silence that followed Steve's ultimatum extended for several seconds as Daniel processed the seriousness of the situation and recognized that he had created consequences that could not be deflected through legal argumentation or professional posturing. Daniel eventually offered an apology that appeared genuine, acknowledging that his comment about Marjorie had been completely inappropriate and that he had no justification for making disparaging remarks about Steve's wife regardless of any opinions he might hold about Steve's professional work or public persona. He expressed regret for having abused the access that participating in Family Feud had provided, acknowledged that his behavior had violated basic expectations of respectful conduct, and committed to treating Steve with appropriate courtesy for the remainder of the taping. Harvey accepted Daniel's apology, but made clear that the trust that had been broken would not be immediately restored and that Daniel's subsequent behavior would be monitored with zero tolerance for any additional provocations or disrespectful conduct. Steve then demonstrated his professionalism by speaking with the other members of the Morrison family, acknowledging that they had not been responsible for Daniel's behavior and expressing his desire to ensure they had a positive experience despite the serious conflict that had occurred. His interaction with the Morrison family members was notably warmer than his exchange with Daniel, communicating that his protective response had been specifically targeted at the person who had crossed the boundary rather than representing generalized hostility toward the entire family. The taping resumed after an extended break that allowed the heightened emotions to settle and the atmosphere in the studio to return to something approximating normal energy levels. Daniel Morrison's behavior for the remainder of the show was dramatically subdued compared to his earlier aggressive competitiveness. He participated in the game without creating additional conflicts, answered questions when his turn came, and generally conducted himself in a manner that suggested he had genuinely understood the seriousness of Steve's response and the reality that any further provocations would result in immediate removal from the taping. The Morrison family ultimately lost their game by a narrow margin, a result that might have been different if Daniel had been more focused on strategic gameplay rather than on establishing dominance during the earlier portions of the taping. After the official conclusion of the episode, Steve made a point of speaking individually with each member of the Morrison family except Daniel, thanking them for their participation and expressing hope that they would remember the experience positively despite the conflict that had occurred. His deliberate exclusion of Daniel from these post-taping courtesies communicated that while he had accepted the apology sufficiently to allow the taping to continue, he harbored no goodwill toward someone who had insulted his wife and required such extraordinary intervention. The footage from Steve's confrontation with Daniel Morrison was not included in the broadcast version of the episode when it eventually aired several weeks later. The producers made editorial decisions that presented the Morrison family's appearance as a standard episode without any indication of the serious conflict that had occurred during the commercial break. However, accounts from people who had been present in the studio during the incident circulated through social media and entertainment industry networks, generating extensive discussion about appropriate protective responses when family members are insulted and about the boundaries that exist even in entertainment contexts where tolerance for provocative behavior is typically high. The accounts from studio audience members and production staff emphasized several aspects of Steve's response that distinguished it from typical defensive reactions to insults. First, his ability to articulate clearly why the insult was offensive rather than simply reacting with anger or demanding apology without explanation. Second, his willingness to share personal information about his marriage and his relationship history to provide context that helped people understand the significance of what had been said. Third, his maintenance of professional composure even while defending his wife with unmistakable intensity and conviction. Fourth, his fairness in providing Daniel with a genuine opportunity to correct his behavior rather than immediately exercising the option to remove him from the taping. The incident prompted broader discussions about the boundaries that should exist in entertainment contexts and about whether the tolerance for provocative behavior that characterized much reality television had created unrealistic expectations that anything could be said in pursuit of dramatic moments without facing genuine consequences. Several entertainment professionals noted that Daniel Morrison's comment about Steve's wife represented exactly the kind of boundary violation that deserved immediate and serious response, and they praised Steve's handling of the situation as a model for how to defend family members with controlled intensity rather than with reactive aggression that would have been understandable but less effective. For Steve Harvey, the confrontation with Daniel Morrison reinforced his understanding that certain values transcended professional considerations and that protecting his family required responses that prioritized their dignity over entertainment value or professional protocol. He spoke about the incident in subsequent interviews, explaining that his willingness to share personal information about his marriage during the confrontation had been calculated to help Daniel and the audience understand why the insult had been particularly offensive and why it demanded a response that went beyond his usual tolerance for inappropriate behavior. He emphasized that defending his wife was non-negotiable regardless of professional context, and that anyone who chose to insult Marjorie should expect a response that would be controlled but unmistakable in its intensity and its communication of absolute boundaries. Steve also reflected on the broader principle that public figures and their families deserved basic respect even when their lives were subject to public scrutiny and discussion. He acknowledged that his career choices had made aspects of his personal life public, and that people were entitled to form opinions about his relationship history, his marriages, and his credibility on relationship topics. However, he argued that the availability of information about public figures did not create license to make gratuitous insulting comments about their spouses, particularly in contexts where the public figure had no ability to avoid the interaction and where the insult served no purpose beyond inflicting hurt. The Morrison family's experience on Family Feud became a cautionary tale about the consequences of allowing competitive energy or professional aggression to override basic social awareness about appropriate boundaries in personal interactions. Several members of Daniel's family later expressed privately that they had been mortified by his comment about Marjorie and frustrated that his poor judgment had created a situation that had overshadowed what should have been a positive family experience. They acknowledged that Steve Harvey's response had been entirely justified and that Daniel's insulting comment had deserved the serious consequences it provoked. As we conclude this significant story, it is worth reflecting on what Steve Harvey's response to Daniel Morrison teaches us about family loyalty, appropriate protective responses, and the boundaries that exist even in professional contexts where tolerance for difficult behavior is typically high. Steve could have ignored Daniel's insult to avoid confrontation, could have responded with explosive anger that would have been emotionally satisfying but professionally damaging, or could have simply removed Daniel from the taping without explanation or opportunity for correction. Instead, he chose a response that communicated absolute boundaries with controlled intensity, that provided context for why the insult was particularly offensive, that offered genuine opportunity for acknowledgement and apology, and that maintained sufficient professional composure to avoid creating a situation that would damage his reputation or undermine his effectiveness as a host. The contestant who insulted Steve Harvey's family learned that certain boundaries exist that will provoke protective responses regardless of professional context or entertainment considerations. Daniel Morrison discovered that making disparaging comments about someone's spouse is fundamentally different from critiquing their professional work. That access gained through participating in a television program carries obligations of basic respectful conduct, and that violating those obligations will result in consequences that are immediate, serious, and non-negotiable. Steve's handling of the situation demonstrated that defending family members does not require explosive anger or aggressive confrontation, but rather can be accomplished through controlled intensity, clear articulation of boundaries, and willingness to implement consequences when those boundaries are violated. The response that audiences never saw on their television screens was not dramatic conflict or theatrical confrontation, but rather dignified, intense, and absolutely uncompromising defense of family by a man whose professional tolerance for difficult behavior found its absolute limit. When someone chose to insult his wife, the confrontation lasted perhaps 15 minutes but communicated values that transcended the immediate situation, demonstrating that certain loyalties and certain protective instincts exist that override professional protocols and that demand responses which prioritize family dignity over entertainment value or conflict avoidance. Steve Harvey's willingness to defend his wife with controlled but unmistakable intensity, to share personal information in service of helping people understand why the insult was offensive, and to maintain professional composure while enforcing non-negotiable boundaries revealed character that went deeper than his television persona and values that defined him more fundamentally than his professional success.